another important kind of factor in the engagement between Koreans and foreigners, but perhaps in this case we can't really call them that, is the adoptee scheme as well as the return migration of Koreans. And they shouldn't really be called or kind of used in the same language because they are different. But I do that because they both bring up the issue of what it means to be Korean, and also can you find, in a sense, yourself by being in the country of birth. So hopefully through this lecture you can maybe help find an angle or several angles to explain the background and the issues regarding Korean adoptees returning to Korea. I will highlight just a few small aspects of that. So it may be useful in discussing the adoption scheme and also return migration. May be useful to have good knowledge of the rapid industrialization of South Korea in the 1970s and 80s and what it meant to the people. And I guess this aspect itself, by having this on screen, already kind of suggests that it is very important, this rapid industrialization, to what it means for people to be Korean. Because up until this point, I don't think Koreans had that much to embrace Korea for. And it's in the 70s and 80s when the I guess when the economy starts to really grow fast, that is when Koreans start to become, in a sense, start to become more passionate about being in Korea, being a Korean. And of course, I'm not saying that they weren't patriotic before, but a lot of people were still thinking of maybe migrating to the United States in the early 70s. But then in the 70s and 80s, the situation in Korea gets better and better, the living conditions. And so you see that this starts to change people's minds maybe about the United States being this, for example, this utopia. Korea is starting to look a little bit better with every year. And yet, in the 70s and 80s, as you know, many people were sent abroad, either to work, as in Germany, with nurses and men going to work as miners, but also those who did not have a family that wanted to care for them as adoptees. So that was a massive scheme that involved at least something like 200,000 young Korean children, some not that young, but most were young. And this was, as I've mentioned before, a way of curbing expenditure on welfare. It was also a way of, at least that's how it was marketed, a way of giving your child everything it might need to later come back or at least be successful. It wasn't always clear how they might come back because migration was not easy, but it was sold as a way to Koreans, as a way of giving your child the best opportunity because life in Korea was going to be tough. So in the late 80s then and early 90s, adopted Koreans, so we shouldn't in a sense call them Koreans anymore, they do start to come back as adults. And there are many of them are American, so from the United States and Canada. Sometimes they come back with their children, but many of them are adopted. Many of them are not. Some have just simply migrated and start to feel it's time to maybe come back, especially after the LA riots. As John Lee and Nancy Abelman have pointed out, many Koreans started to feel that maybe the United States wasn't the utopia it once was, and they did not feel accepted as much anymore living in the United States. And so with some of the wealth that some had, they also started to feel that perhaps life was a lot easier and more comfortable in South Korea. And certainly South Korea was a much less violent country than America or the United States. And so that was quite powerful. And so Korean Americans started to consider coming back, and a fair number did. At the same time, we also see adoptees returning. The problem for a lot of the adoptees is that when they finally come back, and you see in this image here, you see that the number increases considerably over the years, they are not really seen as Koreans by many people, not initially. I think the media over the years have improved the people's understanding of adoptees considerably, but initially Koreans tended to be rather kind of nationalist. There was this great sense of ethnic nationalism that led to adoptees returning here for even just a short holiday and being treated poorly by, for example, a taxi driver. As I once witnessed, I had a friend, this was back in the 90s, who was kind of verbally attacked by a taxi driver for being with a foreigner at first, because I was helping her find her birth parents. And then when he realized there was no relationship with me, but she didn't speak Korean, he scolded her for not speaking Korean. So there was really nothing she could do right. Even though the driver was a taxi driver, not trying to diss taxi drivers, but it wasn't like he had really benefited from being here in Korea either. And perhaps that's what also made him angry, of course. But it happened again in that same week. An old man on the underground, as we were coming back from finally meeting her birth parents, having found them, again attacked her for being not really Korean. So this is something that I don't think happens today, but there was, for a while, was a sentiment that was rather negative towards adoptees. And hopefully, but I can't speak on behalf of adoptees, hopefully that's no longer really the case, although it may simmer a little bit, especially when the language is still an issue with adoptees. When they want to come back here for a little while, I think the expectation is that you speak fluent Korean at least very quickly. And if you're just not that good at learning Korean, then I think this may work against you. Another problem that a lot of these adoptees may have faced is that apart from perhaps a certain animosity, is that they simply weren't able to find their birth parents, which is what many people came to do. Not all, though. Some adoptees have decided that they're not interested in finding their birth parents. That also happens for all kinds of reasons. But most, I believe, have felt an urge to at least know who they are. When it's clear that the adoption agency at the time really did not do a good job finding or registering the actual birth parents, then that can be very frustrating. And At some point, as you can see here, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had to investigate claims that many of the adoptees had been sent overseas based on falsified records. That doesn't mean that the original parents were completely lost. It just meant that the agencies made it impossible to trace the original parents for whatever reasons. Here's another example of communication between an adoption agency and an adoptee. So it says it was made up just for adoption procedures. It's, of course, a rather sad thing to have to experience, especially when you save up money to go to Korea and search for something that is so incredibly personal and can be so incredibly important to you as a person. Still, even when they find their birth parents, they may still face issues. One of the issues is they may find them too late when they've passed away. And sometimes they will also find that the birth parents really did not care that much. And that's not uncommon. I've heard stories like this where the birth parent simply says, well, you know, that's what we all did at the time. I just wanted to give you a better life, and it's nice to see you. And so that can also be very hurtful. I've seen many cases like this over the years. Of course, it's absolutely not the majority, but when this happens, this can be kind of confronting, especially if you put up your hopes. There's been all kinds of very sad issues over the years. One case I encountered was someone who finally found the birth father, and this relates to the poor record keeping, and developed a good relationship with the father, but when he passed away, she went to the funeral and found the details of her birth mother, who she traced and who then said, actually, you weren't our daughter. I'm convinced, I'm absolutely sure you weren't. You're nice, but you weren't our daughter. And that actually meant that for years she was under the impression that she had found her birth parents, and now she still doesn't. And so even when you find your birth parents, the issues are not gone at all, of course, because you will always wonder why me, especially if you find that, as in the one case I mentioned back in the 90s, when this young woman finally met her birth parents, and she met her other 3 sisters and brothers. So why was she the only one being put up for adoption? So there's a lot of questions that this can raise, very sensitive issues. And so, yeah, it's certainly a very sad chapter in Korea's post-war history. Thankfully, the adoptees have organized themselves, and they've set up all kinds of NGOs. Some are very international, some are more local. So KORUD and INCAS are 2 kind of local ones. Actually, INCAS is not local, but KORUD is. And what they do is they basically provide all kinds of assistance to people wanting to come to Korea to find their birth parents. And KORUD is it's a bit like a small hotel. So they provide accommodation, and they provide assistance, translation, interpretation, all that, just like INCAS can do for you. There's a number of other agencies as well, and so they really provide a lot of support, and it's of course wonderful to be able to meet others. But even so, I think that the issues someone faces are always incredibly individual and private, and so even being part of an NGO like this and working with them will be very helpful, but it will always maybe remind them of how unique every individual is in their experience of being put up for adoption. In more recent years, they have set up, several of these NGOs have managed to get the government to set up kind of a special adoption act. That was about, I think it's about 15, 20 years ago. And with that act, now adoption has become more difficult in a sense. So they now insist that the registration is done properly. They also make sure that the birth mother really agrees with the adoption, so that she cannot be forced by her husband, for example, or by parents. So she really has to agree to it. They also insist now that the mother spends at least some time with her child before she puts it up for adoption. And that new act allows mothers to basically come back on her decision within 6 months. Now this then has also led some people to say that actually that act may stop some people from putting their child up for adoption because there are too many barriers. And so what you end up doing is making it more likely that someone just abandons the child instead, rather than having to go through the motions of all this paperwork and all these regulations. It is certainly part of a bigger problem, as even today there's about 4,000 kids, or 5,000 perhaps now, in South Korea who are in need of welfare. And so if you think of the numbers of adoption and then the number of people who really survive on welfare, kids, then there is a bigger problem here to look at as well, in addition to the problem of adoption and managing their interest as best as possible. It's complex and it's incredibly individual. It's also very complicated because a lot of documents have been lost and forged, poorly registered, poorly written. So it's a very complex part of Korean history, but an important one.